Hello and welcome back to History for Atheists. My guest today is Dr. Ada Palmer, Associate Professor of Early Modern European History at the University of Chicago and author of Inventing the Renaissance, Myths of a Golden Age. I must say I haven't enjoyed reading a book as much as this one in quite some time. Dr. Palmer takes the traditional idea of the Renaissance, that it was a glorious rebirth of reason, artistic mastery and secular thinking after a centuries-long dark age, and shows that this is almost entirely nonsense. She then takes the reader on a remarkable tour of the people, places and periods that we can associate with the Renaissance, and shows, as usual, that the real history is much more complex, varied and interesting than the pop history cliches. It's a highly entertaining, chatty and personable read. She manages to make some very complex history rather fun. So it was no surprise to find that Ada Palmer is as much fun in person as she is on the page. We had a long discussion about the common misconceptions about the concept of the Renaissance, the myth of the Dark Ages, and the misunderstanding of how secular and non-religious these people and periods were or were not. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Ada Palmer as much as I did. Ada Palmer, welcome to History for Atheists. Thank you very much for coming along and speaking to us about your excellent book, which I'll wave in front of the camera, Inventing the Renaissance, Myths of a Golden Age, which I finished reading this morning and which I absolutely love. And I'm going to have to go back and underline lots and lots of passages. Haven't had so much fun, as I said to you before we started recording, reading a history book in years. So congratulations on a brilliant book. For those who haven't had the opportunity to read it yet, and I encourage everyone to do so, how would you summarise what you're arguing?
So the book is a weird-ass book. I'll start with that. It isn't structured like anything usual, because part of what it's about is trying to talk about the discipline of academic history and how it works and how it continues from the history-making process of our ancestors. So it looks at the question of the Renaissance. Where does the idea come from that there is a golden age? Where does the idea come from that there was a dark age? Are dark ages and golden ages even real? No. But where did this myth come from? And then why has this myth been transformed over time? So it's a story about the invention of a historical time period. And so it looks at Petrarch, the first person to describe the Dark Ages as dark. It looks at Renaissance figures and why in their period it was politically convenient to talk about coming from an age of ash and shadow to a more golden one. But it continues that story forward, and it talks about the 17th century, the 18th century, and the 19th century, and the 20th century, and all the different reasons that we love in our imaginations the idea that there was a fall, and then there was a grim dark age, and then there was a golden age that comes after it. And this is a very satisfying and simple narrative that has been evergreen and useful for different people, especially people who want to claim the Renaissance. Because in many ways, what the Renaissance really is the claim that there was some factor which makes modern people different from medieval people. And that when that arrived and began, there was a new era. That was the beginning of moving toward modernity. In other words, the Renaissance isn't about the Renaissance at all. It's about our ideas of what makes us modern. And a lot of books that talk about the Renaissance formulated as, the first modern man was, and then they'll say Machiavelli, or they'll say Petrarch or something. And that, the beginning of the modern mind was here. And so when you read a dozen different books about the Renaissance, they'll make a dozen different claims that the arrival of this X factor began the change from what had been a stable, stagnant thing toward the ever-going arc that is modernity. And different people will claim a different thing. And so if I go to a museum gift shop at the Uffizi, where there's this shelf that has 10 different books about what is the Renaissance and who are the Medici, because it's Florence, so it's Medici there. Depending on which of the 10 you pick up, you're about to go through a portal into a parallel universe in which a different thing will be credited as the heart of the Renaissance, each of them being credited as the heart of what makes us modern. And to give one of the easiest and therefore crassest examples, the others are subtler. One theory that has been proposed about what made the Renaissance begin is the development of modern banking and finance and double entry bookkeeping and insurance and the growth of these large banks, which meant that sort of the proto stages of modern banking begin in the late 1300s and in the 1400s. And then as they explode, they facilitate the movement of people, the movement of goods, the movement of ideas via these channels of trade, and that everything burbles up from the advent of banking. And this thesis was really popular during the nastier phases of the Cold War, because you could say that, therefore, the good golden age, the Renaissance, was born from the beginnings of capitalism. And you can then compare communism to the bad, stagnant, communal, negative, uncapitalistic dark age. And you would get not only books about this, where a historian whose book normally sells 1,000 copies suddenly sells 10,000 copies because it's hit a nerve with the public.
Yeah.
But you also get journalists who turn it into something that they can run in the Times or the Post. So, there would be these flashes of moments where somebody's idea of this thing defined the Renaissance hits popular zeitgeist and feels like, yes, this is what we want modern to be. And all of these different X factors, as I argue in the book, all of them are right. Like, all of them are true. All of them are a real thing that really happened in the Renaissance. It's just that when you try to narrow it down to a single factor, you get a weird distortion that is often used for political purposes, like the capitalism is what caused the Renaissance political purpose, which is a very simplistic example, but there are dozens of others. And I try in the book to create a portrait of a messy, plural, complicated Renaissance in which all of these different factors are real and all of these different factors are happening at the same time and braiding with each other. And we can't define it by one characteristic or say this is what makes the world be turned toward modern. Yeah. A whole bunch of different processes were underway, intermingling with each other, making the world different, making the world shapeshift, making the world complicated, some of which were changes that to us can feel modern, some of which are changes that to us don't feel modern at all, and we have to go forward several more centuries before things feel modern. Gotcha. So the book is about the fact that we like golden ages and dark ages, and we've used this myth over and over to make a simplified and less messy past. And if we want to really understand both the past and how history works, we need the messy, complicated, multi-factor one instead.
Gotcha. You just mentioned writers who normally don't sell bestsellers and suddenly get a bestseller. So I read a book by a scholar called Stephen Greenblatt. It even won a Pulitzer Prize, and it said that there was this terrible period called the Dark Ages where it was full of flagellating monks. And then one book, Lucriccius' On the Nature of Things, came along. Everyone read it, and it made the world modern. I believe you may be familiar with Lucriccius.
Yes.
Just a touch. Could you tell us if Stephen Greenblatt may be possibly even slightly wrong?
Well, so it's a book that's very important and formative to me. And so here's the autobiographical side that is very candid. Stephen was finishing writing that book when I was finishing my dissertation at Harvard, and we were both at Harvard. And he reached out to me knowing that my dissertation was on the reception of Lucriccius in the Renaissance. This is my field that I was finishing my first academic book on, which is called Reading Lucriccius in the Renaissance. And so in my final year as a PhD student, he proposed that we trade manuscripts, and he sent me the drafts of the Swerve, and I sent him the draft of Reading Lucriccius in the Renaissance. And I went through the Swerve, and I gave him lots of details because I knew this field and sort of the technical, what family was who and who was where kind of things much more. There are many individual sentences in the Swerve where my craftsmanship is present. But I was then a graduate student. And one thing a graduate student has is the trees, but not the forest. Which is to say the zoomed in details of who was where and what was happening and what the thesis of a particular text is, but not the zoomed out maturity of a historian who can say, what are the larger sweeping problems? So every individual paragraph in the Swerve is right. And yet the larger sweeping portrait that it makes is very complicated. And to give a sense of its complication, the year after it came out, when I was then a young professor just starting in my first professorship, and my book was on its way out and coming soon. And I had a big article that was a sort of preview for the book that was in the Journal of the History of Ideas. And then I had the experience at the Renaissance Society of America conference that year, the big conference in my field, of having 37 separate people pull me aside to say how much they hated the swerve. And to ask me, as someone who was doing my dissertation on exactly this and was therefore an authority in the field, to validate their hatred of the swerve.
I would have been person number 38. I can tell you, I hate that book with every fibre of my being. But anyway, do go
on. Because it's a book you can't hate simply. It's a complex book to hate because all the trees are right. And the question of why is the forest giving me the heebie-jeebies when the trees are all right is a really weird feeling. And it was when I had those conversations over and over and over, and I had a semi-answer, but I didn't have a real answer. They got me thinking hard about, if this book is bothering the experts in this field this much, then it merits a really good, deep answer of what is the problem with the swerve and what is going on, right? When a book is merely wrong, people are like, well, that book was wrong. And then they move on and they don't care. And giants in the field don't pull a PhD student aside to ask for validation of their feelings, right, about a book. And so I spent the first decade of my historian career working on an answer to Greenblatt. Working on an answer to and he's a great person who, read through my dissertation and gave me good advice, which made my book better, and who was sincerely working hard on a good book. He merits a really sophisticated answer. And it took me a long time to get to that answer, and a lot of practice at conferences and so on. So that, that answer is, as you know, in part 4, I think it is, of Inventing the Renaissance, where I talk about it. It's also in an obscure journal that nobody can get a hold of, which is why I repeated it in the book. But more generally, when you zoom in on Giordano Bruno and you have this dramatic trial, or you zoom in on Poggio and he is traipsing through the Alps because he has this great ideal of finding Lucriccius, you're 100% correct that those individual panels within the comic book happened. But it's an image as if you've taken 2 panels from a comic book and blown them up into portraits and hung them on the wall, and you don't have the rest of the narrative that goes around them, in which the things that those individuals were doing were part of larger movements. So I'll take Poggio first, because Greenblatt gives us this vivid marching through the snow, searching for Lucriccius. But you don't march through the snow searching for Lucriccius unless people want it.
Yep.
And similarly, when people talk about Gutenberg inventing the printing press and then there are exponentially more books, why in 1450 and not before, not after, is the movable type printing press happening? Is because there was already a movement of people excited to find this stuff, who were looking for it. The people who were exchanging letters with Poggio and sending him money, his friends, his teachers, the correspondents to whom he sent copies of this. There was a movement of people already, right? Just as there was a movement of people which made Gutenberg say, if I could produce 300 copies of a book cheap, I might be able to sell all of them, because there are 300 people who are actually building a library who want books, which is unprecedented at that point, right? That the momentum precedes the instant. And similarly with the trial of Giordano Bruno, momentum preceding instant. The really useful statistic to make yourself go, wait a minute, this is more complicated than I want, is that if you go through the records of the Inquisition, of which there are hundreds of thousands of cases of trials, the Roman Inquisition, the Italian one, that's the center where he is. And I've talked and worked with a lot of Inquisition scholars, and this whole project and the desire to respond to Greenblatt led me to, I got to understand how the Inquisition works. And so my next book is going to be on censorship and the Inquisition, and I've really deep dived into this stuff. If you go through the hundreds of thousands of cases of trials in Rome in this period, there are 12 of scientists, and they're all from the same decade. And the Galileo trial and the Giordano Bruno trial are in the same decade, and they're all in that decade because something hot was happening, not long term, right? These trials are not what the Inquisition is normally like. They were the hot topic of that moment. And in general, when you go through Inquisition trials, what you'll notice is that there are spikes and then it goes away again because a particular thing is being scapegoated. A particular thing is being what people are scared of. And so you'll, for example, go through the Inquisition archive in, Sicily. Let's say we're looking at the archive in Sicily. This is one of the ones I've looked at the numbers for. And you'll be looking at one particular decade. And in that decade, there will be, over 1,000 trials for Judaizing, this thing where people believed that formerly converted by force Jews were infiltrating Christianity and tried to seed it with sort of undermining theology that would make Catholicism collapse from within. This was never true, but it was a thing, a phantom people were afraid of, right? And in one decade, there would be 1,000 trials for this. And the next decade, in the same place, there would be 8 instead of over 1,000. You'd be like, what happened? The answer is that the paranoia about that particular thing spiked and then went away. In exactly the same way we see in modernity, where there will be a big spike in anxiety about like Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
And it'll be all over the news. And then the next decade, it's gone and no one cares about it, right? Or the comic book craze that happened in 1954. And then there was, national fear about comic books destroying our youth. And then, like, my students have never even heard that happened because it happened and then it went away, right? So what your question, when you find something where all the trials of scientists are the same decade, you haven't found what the Inquisition did all the way through the Middle Ages. You found what the Inquisition was doing in the year 1600, between 1510 and 1590 and 1600, and that something was going on that made them do that. Just as when you have Poggio hiking through the Alps, something was going on in 1415, 1417 that meant that somebody who's suddenly unemployed because his pope got depoped, and when your pope gets depoped, you're out of work. His pope got depoped. He found himself unemployed. What does he do? He has friends who will send him enough money to live on to hike through the Alps looking for these rare manuscripts because there are people who already want them. And so what needed to happen with Greenblatt is the linking of these flash, portraits of a real thing that happened to the larger trends that they were part of to show that this isn't one unique genius doing this thing. And it isn't chance. It's a systemic project in which a lot of people got together and said, we want to change the world. We want to change the world this way.
Yeah, there's a few things, a lot of things to unpack there. I really love that part in your book where you were talking about the Inquisition as a kind of like a barometer of what the latest satanic panic was.
Yeah.
Personally, I'd argue that the trial didn't really have much to do with science at all, and he was more
totally
science
agree.
adjacent than anything else.
But the reason that the officials allowed the trial to get to the big stage, right? Because almost all Inquisition trials stop in the "you're naughty, don't do it again" stage.
Go away and listen to these sermons. Yeah,
the equivalent of plea bargain stage of a prosecution stopping, right? Almost all of them stopped there. The reason Bruno's trial, which was entirely at the beginning about the fact that he pissed off his patron and the patronage network, and then Rome being angry at Venice and being like, oh my God, Venice finally extradited somebody. This is the first person Venice has extradited in 500 years. We've been desperately trying to get Venice to extradite its heretics for so long. Let's throw the book at this guy, which has everything to do with Rome and Venice hating each other and nothing to do. This is the stress of the Fourth Crusade still lingering, right? This is big old stuff just coming down on Bruno's head by the time he's in Rome. But the fact that it was a scientist who gets picked on in the same moment that it's happening to Galileo and the other 10 guys, all of whom were acquitted without anything happening, fines in a couple of cases, shows that in that moment there was something that made these trials get all the way to the trial stage when normally they would stop in the "you've been chided by your parish priest" stage, right?
Yeah, I'm in the process of writing what's going to be a monumentally long article for my website, which I've been putting off for years, about Galileo and trying to debunk the myths of Galileo. One of the things I try to argue with people is that the Galileo trial was about politics, and mainly about interpersonal politics.
Yeah.
And your section on patronage and the importance of patronage in this period, that was a classic example of where a courtier annoyed his patron.
Yep.
Quite justifiably, and so the patron stomped on him. And this is why I often say to people: if you read the actual documents of the Galileo trial, science almost never gets mentioned.
Yep.
It's largely about, did you break this order in 1616, and also implicitly, did you lie to the Pope by not telling him about that order? And really, they were just, he was going to get found guilty regardless, because the Pope had basically said, find a way. So that had nothing to do, virtually nothing to do with science. Science was peripheral.
And Bruno's as well, right? He had already been examined by the Inquisition twice. And both of those were, be good and go home. But the third time, it's his own patron that denounces him and is pissed at him and thinks that he's a charlatan and has been scamming the guy. And when your own patron hurls you to the wolves devour you, because this is a system in which the judicial system itself and the patronage system are intertwined with each other. And there is the assumption that the vast majority of legal cases will result in the patron talking to the people in power, the people in power relenting because of the trading of favors. I don't want to derail fully onto that, the issue of how patronage works, right? But there's that really telling scene in Richard III when the King Edward IV is on the throne and he's upset and a bunch of stuff is happening. And then a dude we've never seen before and we'll never see again comes in and kneels before the king and says, "My servant has murdered a guy. I must beg your majesty to get him off." And Edward gives a speech that concludes in, this is totally unjust, but I have to do it anyway, because that's how things work, and does, right? And it's not even my man is innocent, please protect him, your majesty. It's my guy is totally guilty. I totally murdered this dude. However, I work for you, therefore, please get him off. And the king says, yes, and I have to do it, even though I know it is unjust, right? And that really is how the political system works at the time. The social safety net is a patronage system. And if you are in the patronage system, then you get the mild punishment. You get the small fine and the chide and don't do it again for things that are on the books as a capital crime. So we're all aware how, sodomy is on the books as a capital crime. But 99% of the time when you're denounced for sodomy, you talk to your patron, they talk to people, you apologize, you pay a small fine, you're let off. If you've pissed off your patron, that's when it goes all the way to the end and you get genuinely cracked down upon it. We have these wonderful letters of Machiavelli and his friends about a point in Rome when there was a particular cardinal who had a bee in his bonnet about gay men having too much gay sex. And, the friend is writing to Machiavelli saying, everybody I know who doesn't work for a cardinal is really scared, and they're all trying to get a job working for a cardinal. Because if you work for a cardinal, you can be as gay as you like and not do anything, right? Which is what protects Michelangelo and others.
So just back to your point, though, about the fact that Poggio is, I would argue, is an example of an effect rather than the cause.
Exactly.
Something was already happening.
Exactly.
But I suppose one of the arguments that I often have with people about the Renaissance is I argue that was more of a what rather than a when, because the problem with using the Renaissance as a period, even though in a way it can sometimes work, is that there's no kind of beginning or end to it, and actually it's highly elastic. So people stretch it all the way back. You make this point, all the way back to say Giotto. So Giotto is Renaissance, but the 100 Years' War is medieval, even though the 100 Years' War began the year Giotto died. Chaucer is medieval, but Petrarch and Boccaccio
are
Renaissance.
Yeah, even though they knew each other.
Yeah. And the Renaissance.
And Poggio is the beginning of, Poggio is Renaissance, but Poggio attended Henry V's wedding.
Yeah.
Right before the birth of Henry VI, that somehow the Wars of the Roses are mostly medieval, right?
It doesn't make any sense.
Because Renaissance is when we think the thing that is good began, that makes things different from the past.
Yeah.
And so if you're an art historian, it's going to be Giotto. But if you're a theater person, it's going to be immediate predecessors of Shakespeare, which is why when I go to campus and I turn right out of the history department and go down the hall to the English department and ask them when's Renaissance, they'll say, oh, it really gets going in 1550 and it comes to its peak in 1600 with Shakespeare. And if I turn left down the same hallway and go to the Italianists, they'll say, oh, it is really very strong by 1250. And the Black Death and its aftermath are a very Renaissance event, and Dante and Petrarch are the peak of this, and by the time you get to Machiavelli, you're in modern already. So modern is 1500, and the Renaissance is really tapering out by the 1420s when the Medici are rising in power and everything is going to suck. So the Renaissance is ending 150 years before it begins, depending on who you ask about when it is, because the Renaissance is when the good things that we like that make us different from the past start.
Yep. Yep.
And that is very elastic. And since it's elastic, it's therefore very subjective and chameleonic and inconsistent.
So, I'm paraphrasing, but C.S. Lewis once said something along the lines of that the Renaissance is effectively the bits of the Middle Ages that modern people like,
yep.
which is funny and pretty true in many respects. But history for atheists is very much about how my fellow atheists quite often get history wrong, and they don't use the Renaissance in isolation, or their high school grasp of the Renaissance in isolation. It's always in contrast. So it's always in contrast to the Dark Ages, which is another one of those incredibly elastic things, which sometimes means the whole of the Middle Ages. But then if you point out stuff like the 12th century Renaissance or Chaucer or cathedrals or the printing press or eyeglasses, they say, oh, no, it wasn't that part of the Middle Ages. It was the early bit, where things were really, really bad. So they kind of stretch it to suit themselves. But can we talk about the Dark Ages? Because as I mentioned, I'm right at the moment, I'm in the middle of an amusing Twitter argument with a couple of people who are desperately trying to defend the concept of the Dark Ages. So surely the Dark Ages happened. Are we wrong about that?
I mean, if we use the Dark Ages as a term to mean we have few textual sources for this period, right? Because that's the way historians really started using it. There's two different inventions of the Dark Ages. There's Petrarch, who we'll get to in a bit, back in my period, saying the previous century was crap, let's make something better, and referring to the age in which he lives, not the age before him, but the age in which he is, as an age of ash and shadow, and a bad thing that has come after the fall of Rome. And so here he's someone who lives through the Black Death, right? So we are in the late 1300s when he says, this is an age of ash and shadow, let us collaborate to build a better one. And I hope we'll come back to that a lot, because that's where Poggio comes from.
Yep.
But the other half of the term Dark Age is historians used it to mean the period when we didn't have very many textual sources. And we had a lot of textual sources from antiquity. We had a lot of textual sources from later, but then we had very few textual sources in the middle, for the very practical reasons that when medieval Europe lost access to papyrus because there were pirates on the seas and you couldn't import it safely from Egypt, and so they're not writing on cheap papyrus anymore. They're writing on expensive dead sheep, and a dead sheep is a much more expensive thing than a papyrus. If you've ever tried to buy a sheet of paper and tried to buy a whole sheep, you have understood this difference, only slightly exaggerated. Papyrus being plant-based and much less human labor than the rearing of an animal and the tanning of skin. Much less book production can happen because a single medieval book costs in labor as much as a house, and in money as much as a house. And therefore there are few books produced. And 19th century historians who are very dependent on the textual tradition for writing of history, therefore think of this as a patch when we don't know what happened because there's very little history. Now, modern historians really don't think about it the same way, because we've developed all these great techniques to write histories of things using sources that aren't text, because we use DNA, and we use carbon dating, and we use, sonic prints of foundations, and we use what's stuck in your tooth enamel, and all these wonderful techniques that 19th century historians, when they named the Dark Ages, didn't anticipate we would ever have. And we can now write deep, robust, complicated histories that cover social class and upheaval and economics and so on, even in times and places when we have almost no texts or no texts, right? And there are people who study the Hittites who are like, they didn't write down their language. The Hittites only have one library. It's a list of oaths people made to mountain gods, so they can look up if somebody accidentally broke their oath to a mountain god and see whether the mountain god is now angry, and that's why there's the plague. That is the entire textual history of the Hittites, right? And yet we can write a history of the Hittites by using material culture, by using metallurgy, by using trade networks, by using horse bones. And so in as much as the Dark Ages were named that by historians, they aren't dark anymore because we have DNA and horse bones. We know how to write a history without text. And so it was dark, and now it's bright because we've shown other lights of science on it in exactly the same way that scientists explore cells or Pluto, right? And Pluto, or the dark side of the moon, is an exact example, right? The dark side of the moon, which isn't dark, it's just the other side, so we couldn't see it. We couldn't see the Middle Ages when we were using only text. And now we can, because we've got technology to send our satellite to the other side of the moon. We've got technology to understand what's going on in what had been a textual Dark Age. If there is going to be another textual Dark Age, it will be our present, because all of our records are digital and they're hard to archive. And if the software isn't supported in the future, then this might be an area where very few of our sources survive. Historians are very worried about that.
But the people I'm arguing with on Twitter, which is always a fruitless but also fun activity if you look at it in the right way. But what they will occasionally show me books when I tell them historians don't use the term the Dark Age anymore. They will show me books that use the Dark Age in the sense you just referred to,
right? The textual,
which is about, and it's more about Britain and in the kind of the post-Roman period.
Yeah.
But what they then argue is, well, you historians are basically woke revisionists, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to pretend that things weren't dreadful in the early Middle Ages, and they were. So how would you respond?
So I would respond twofold. A, if I had a time machine and could go to the 19th century and talk to the medieval history department at Oxford and tell them, we're going to have all of these amazing tools and we're going to be able to answer all of these amazing questions about your period that you can't now because you don't have the technology, they would cry, right? They would be so happy, and they would say, I never imagined the technology would come that would make our Dark Age light, right? Yeah. The people who used this word, who coined this word, would say the Dark Age has become light now. And they would be overjoyed to know that we have these tools and can open the door and lift the veil upon something that they loved passionately and would love to know more about. So that's half the answer. Sure. The other half of the answer is there's a big distorting difference between how impressive and golden an era looks from the stuff left from it.
Yep.
And what it was actually like to live through. And when you go to a museum collection or, et cetera, and you see medieval stuff and you see Renaissance stuff, you're not seeing all the things that were there. You're seeing the stuff that was consistently preserved by the centuries in between. That process of preservation is often an unconscious process of censorship. And I will give an easy to understand example and then the Renaissance example, right? So almost all books from Roman antiquity that were lost to us were not lost in the burning of the Library of Alexandria, etc. They were lost between the 4th and the 6th centuries AD when the papyri were crumbling, because papyrus has a short lifespan. And Europe did not have the papyrus to copy over all these crumbling books. But they copied over everything that they could. But the copying was done in the centers of learning, in the scriptoria, in the monasteries, which were there because St. Benedict said monks should read books. He said a monk should read a new book every year. So every monastery had to have, sorry with the weird light. So every monastery had to have scriptoria. So the monks copied over the books, and there are twice as many, 10 times as many books as they could copy. So they chose which books to copy, and they copied the books they liked, which is books monk-like. And this is why we have more books by St. Augustine than the entirety of classical Latin, not because the monks deliberately decided to let the classical Latin rot, but because since something had to rot, the monks copied over the books they liked, right? This is an act of sort of unintentional censorship that distorts what survives from antiquity to tip it toward things monks liked, right? So similarly, when museums and archives and churches make decisions about what art do we preserve, what art do we paint over, what art do I purchase from the small rotting church where it's going to rot, what art do I keep, what art do I destroy, people do so with criteria. And because the propaganda of the Renaissance managed to make Italian art and culture from a very specific moment in time be celebrated and be beautiful and be what people wanted to have to claim that they were cultured. And we can talk in a moment about why it was then, but they did it. The stuff from that moment got disproportionately preserved compared to the medieval stuff, which would be disproportionately painted over, left to rot, destroyed, etc. And when you go to a museum collection and you're like, there isn't very much medieval stuff, and what there is sort of okay. And there's all this Renaissance stuff, and it's beautiful. That's half because we kept all the Renaissance stuff, and we didn't keep as much of the medieval stuff. A lot of it is gone. And because we expect the Renaissance to be beautiful, and we forefronted it, we put it on our postcards, and we see it, and we look at it, and we learn to process it when we learn what taste is.
Yeah.
You can tell because the fact it's something baroque.
Right. Our idea of what is beautiful is actually shaped more by the Renaissance.
If you look at Baroque art, you'll be like, oh, that's too much and over the top, right? Even though Baroque art is using all the skills of Renaissance art, and yet something visceral in us says that's like gaudy, like the set of the movie of the Titanic. Yeah. I feel negatively about that. It is too ornate and too gaudy. That's not natural to a human brain. We've been shown images of the Baroque in association with negative things, like the decadence of the Titanic, and especially Spain. And if you're coming from the Anglosphere, you have to remember that there was a vast propaganda machine trying to make us dislike everything Spanish for the whole formation of our civilization over the past 200 years that has made us like Renaissance and find it beautiful and tasteful. Because it is a language of artistic power that we use to communicate positive messages. And we use the art of decadence and the art of primitiveness of the medieval to communicate negativity. So if you've spent all of your time, playing a video game where the good guy's architecture looks like Renaissance architecture, or the bad guy's architecture looks like either medieval architecture or Baroque architecture, and you've been doing this your whole life, it trains us to find one thing beautiful and the other's not. So there's a curated element of it, right?
Sure.
The museum collections themselves, just by sitting there, are not neutral. They are filtered by the preferences and tastes of the centuries that came between us and them, just as what we have from antiquity is disproportionately Christianity shaped, right? Both Christian texts and texts that were Christianizable, like Aristotle. With fewer of the wonderful works of the hedonists and the Epicureans, not because they were lost, but because when a monk sat down to copy something over, he liked Aristotle better than he liked Epicurus.
Yeah,
that has affected Middle Ages too. Right?
To play devil's advocate, and I've got an answer to this myself, but I'll be interested in yours. Most of the people that make this argument actually don't care about art. What they care about is
they don't care about art, but they've been trained by the people who came up with the whole idea, who were art historians. It's hard for us to remember that art history predates history as a discipline for this period. Right? The art historians were studying the Renaissance first, and then the music historians, and then the general historians come in about a century later
on. But these guys often sort of say, yeah, well, that's all very well, but economic activity declined. There was less smelting of lead and iron. There was people went from living in houses with tile roofs and to ones living in houses with thatched roofs. Obviously, this means it was a terrible dark age. I got my answer to that one. I'd be interested in yours.
I mean, there is technological regression because there is trade regression. It is definitely a period in which there's a large constriction and recession, which then grows and broadens. But you have to ask, what makes an age dark on a lot of criteria?
Yeah.
Because one criterion is how much metal is being smelted, and you can make a dark age out of that. Another pretty traditional criterion for asking if a civilization is doing well or doing badly is life expectancy.
Yeah.
Life expectancy in the Middle Ages is way higher than life expectancy in the Renaissance. Life expectancy goes down when trade goes up and people are circulating more and they're bringing the diseases with them. And so, indeed, as these trade networks regenerate and as economies start meaning that people are going back and forth from England to Rome with luxury good trade and wool trade and all these other things, the diseases speed up, the life expectancy plummets. And people are always shocked and dismayed to hear that the medieval average life expectancy of 35 goes down to the Renaissance life expectancy of 18. Nice low record life expectancy there. 18 is the life expectancy in Renaissance Florence. And people always say, well, those aren't real life expectancies because they're including child mortality. It's like they are including child mortality. Both of them are including child mortality. The difference between 35 and 18, which is not a difference in infant mortality or women dying in childbirth, that is mostly kids who are dying between the ages of 3 and 12 from communicable diseases arriving that much more often when people are young and not ready for it. It's kids dying of measles is what it is. Yeah. I was just writing about the French Dauphin dying of measles in my in the middle of my Italian wars. It's that plus the war is getting deadlier because the technology is better and the cannons are bigger and they're blasting the walls down more. And centralization of power means the states are larger and their budgets are bigger and their armies are bigger and the civilian casualties go up. So increase in war deaths, especially of men of between the ages of 16 and 40.
Yeah. So effectively what you're saying is pretty much what I say, which is it depends on what you choose to focus on and what you choose to value.
Exactly. How do you define an age as dark? Is it dark because the life expectancy? Is it dark because the industry? Is it dark because this? Is it dark because that? And you could make a list of 20 different things that you graph, and you're gonna get plummet moments for all of them, and those plummet moments are going to be at different points. And this is where the malleability of what is Renaissance gets you, because if we say, okay, when's the lowest life expectancy? It's Florence in the 1400s and 1300s. Well, our English department people will say that's medieval. And so you can still use it for Dark Age, even if Giotto is already dead and Dante is running around and Machiavelli's parents are there, right? And it depends on because the Dark Ages is as flexible as the Renaissance is. And if you really want to defend there was a unilaterally bad thing for a long time, you can move around and pick and choose, and you'll find a way to make any era look bad, right? And I can pick and choose in the Renaissance and make the Renaissance look way worse than I usually make the Renaissance look if I want. And I can then put that data and claim that it's either medieval or Renaissance, depending on which one I want to make look better.
Sure.
The answer is things go up and things go down and things get better and things get worse and different people have different stuff and people are like, oh, medieval people, they're so grubby and filthy and they don't bathe. And I'm like, Vikings bathed. The Vikings bathed all the time and they had soap and they had great hygiene. And we think they're the most barbaric, desperate, terrible part of the Renaissance, of the Middle Ages, and they probably are. And they're getting 60% of their calorie intake from yogurt because that's the only food they have that they can eat. The other things are like rotten elk meat. But if you want to live on rotten elk meat and have great hygiene and live a long and healthy life in Norway, you totally can do that in the.
One of the main things we find in Viking graves are combs and tweezers and toiletry items. So anyway. Okay. The other
Unlike
thing,
my grubby Italian people who are just eating yesterday's moldy bread all the time and living in their incredibly cramped city states where they're terrified to go outside the walls because they'll murder each other all the time.
So, but the other thing that particularly the anti-religious defenders of the concept of Dark Age versus Renaissance say the Renaissance was a period of secularization, of where people through the Reformation, threw off the smothering hand of the evil old Catholic Church trademark, and eventually launched us to the wonderful sunlit uplands of secular unbelief.
But just like banking, secularization is one of the X factors that people point at as a cause of the Renaissance, and that this anti-religious move and this secular turn and this throwing off of the classics this throwing off of the shackles of religion and superstition and the triumph of reason is the turning point. And that's one of many X factors competing with others. So I thought hard about this before talking to you. I want to preface this part of the conversation with a little tiny bit of additional autobiography, right? I started my PhD in history because I wanted to find atheists in this period. I love Renaissance and Enlightenment and early modern atheists. They are so cool. I had fallen in love with Diderot.
Yep.
As an undergraduate, I had read his incredibly brave writings on atheism in Rameau's Nephew and D'Alembert's Dream. And I especially loved and admired how being an atheist before Darwin, being an atheist in Diderot's era, right, required a profound level of courage because it meant believing in this one thing so fiercely that even though you have no science on your side and you have no explanations as an atheist of how the planets came to be or how they move or why animals are suited to their environments or how anything works, right? Diderot says, I have no answers to any of this, but I feel in my heart that all of this is wrong. And even though I don't have the evidence on my side of a lot of elaborate explanations, all I have is my observation. And the world around me does not appear to me to have an author. And even though I don't have an explanation of where the world came from or any of it, I'm going to turn my back on all established expectation and science and say I'm trusting my observations. That requires such an incredible feat of courage that I just fell in love with Diderot. And all the way through my undergraduate courses on the Enlightenment, which I studied more as an undergraduate than I did the Renaissance, there were these footnotes that would say, and the discovery of Lucriccius in the Renaissance was important to enabling these atheists to thrive because it had these cool ideas, which is why I started my dissertation on this, right? I wanted to find these atheists. And the expectation and the project of my dissertation proposed by methodologies of other scholars was if you find the people who read Lucriccius, right, that's where the closet atheist will be, because Lucriccius has all the nutrients an atheist needs, right? And he has a metaphysics that works without divinity, and he has a physics, and he has a creation story, and he has ethics that you can follow, right? And so the secret hidden away, hiding from the Inquisition, Renaissance atheists that I desperately wanted to find should come out of hiding like deer gathering around a salt lick around Lucriccius. And this is where we will find them, right? That was the heart of the dissertation. I wanted to find them. And when what I found had a very different shape from that, right? This was not somebody who came to the Renaissance wanting to defend the idea that most of these people were theists. This was somebody who wanted to find atheists. But when I sat down with the evidence, discovered, wow, this incredibly brave, rare position is even braver and even rarer than I thought, and a little bit younger. And, the very short précis that I can give of it is there totally are atheists in Machiavelli's day in 1500. There totally are atheists before, but they're far, far fewer than I thought. And the moment at which you start to get more of them is the very late 1500s into the 1600s, when new questions are being asked, and the overthrow of Aristotle and of Ptolemaic geography and so on, and discoveries of things like the circulation of the blood and the fact that the heart is a pump. And if the heart is a pump, then all of medicine for the last millennium was nonsense, right? If all of medicine for the last millennium was nonsense, you have to question everything. And it's that moment of question everything, which doesn't come in 1400. It comes in the 1580s, largely due to the circulation of books. Thank you, printing press. Thank you, printing press, which, of course, as I stated earlier, is because people were looking for manuscripts earlier, but that turn that sent Poggio over the hills, that wasn't a secular turn. I'll talk about what it was in a second.
Yeah.
But it wasn't the secular turn. And there was a secular turn, but it was most of a century later than I thought. And to a lot of people being told this didn't happen in the 1410s, it happened in the 1580s, is like a tiny difference, right? This is still, to us, the same period. But we're talking about a gap in time larger than between Napoleon and Yuri Gagarin's spaceflight. There's a lot of time in there. Yeah. And if you believe that the moon landing is very different for the people who were fighting the Napoleonic Wars, you're right. Yeah. And the generations that in 1580 were reading this stuff and saying, you know, these arguments don't make sense to me. What if everything is different? These wonderful free thinkers were as far from Poggio as the moon landing was from Napoleon. And we have to acknowledge that many intellectual generations worked really hard to get from A to B. Yeah. A was not B, and that's important. And we disrespect the hard work of the scholars who got us from A to B if we want to pretend A was B.
Yeah. So I mean, I always love it when I read someone and I'm talking to someone who agrees with me completely and has come up with the same ideas that I have. Because people have often said to me, I mean, I've spent a lot of time debating people on this stuff. And they say the reason there wasn't much atheism in the Middle Ages or even in the period just after is just that the Catholic Church held everything down and there was no capacity for questioning anything. And once that was broken by the Reformation, then it all flowered. And I point out exactly what you just said. It didn't. It was actually extremely rare, and that was because without Newton and without Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, and Darwin, it's really difficult, as you say. You have to be very, very brave and confident, maybe even foolhardy, to say there is no God when you've got nothing to replace him with.
Yeah, the comparison I always use, and it bothers. Yeah, the comparison I always use is it bothers people, but it really is. If you want to be an atheist in the Middle Ages, it's a lot like being a creationist right now, because you've decided you've glommed onto this one thing that has like no evidence and that disagrees with absolutely everything everyone else says and every university course and every professor, but you're like gonna stick to it anyway, right? It's that antisocial to be an atheist then, because you don't have the science on your side yet. It's very different to be an atheist when you don't have the science on your side yet. Yeah. And so what atheism needs is what births it is good questions, right? Good questions and pointing out the flaws in systems. And the Renaissance was a long period of people arriving at really good questions, which did spawn this. And I want to give a anecdotal example, and then I will give my microhistory of what I mean when I say getting from A to B. But the microcosmic example is I'm often at a party with, fun people and we're introducing each other and I say, I'm a historian of atheism. And they're like, oh, that's so cool. I'm an atheist. Isn't it cool how many atheists there were in the Renaissance? Wasn't it true that? And then they'll have a favorite Renaissance person, usually Leonardo da Vinci, was secretly an atheist. And if you say no, people get really upset. But the answer, importantly, is no, and has to be no, because when you give different inputs to a smart mind, you get different outputs. And to say that these people weren't atheists is not to say that they were closed-minded Catholics. They were radical free thinkers with really cool, bizarre, original, awesome, antisocial, inventive, creative theories as to what could be the best explanation for a thing. But they didn't have the same evidence we have. They had different data because they didn't yet have the telescopes that show us details. They didn't have dinosaurs. They didn't have DNA. They didn't have ideas of evolution. They didn't have the same data going in. And so a brilliant, free-thinking radical mind was absolutely capable of looking at the Catholic Church saying, this is corrupt and oppressive and full of terrible popes. I'm not going to take this seriously for any minute. And they did say that. But they didn't get from that to our comfortable modern Darwin-shaped atheism. They got from that to Platonism and, Zoroastrianism and the wild stuff that Pico is doing on how to turn your soul into a celestial entity by mixing different entities with each other. And they got to soul projection experiments and all sorts of cool stuff. And often I think when a really smart person today who is an atheist asks, wasn't Leonardo or Pico or whoever was secretly also an atheist? What we're actually asking is, if I'd been born in the Renaissance, wouldn't I nonetheless have arrived at atheism? Wouldn't my atheism still be true? Isn't atheism sort of independent of circumstance and when and where you're born, and just if you're smart enough, you realize it? And the answer to that is no. But the answer is, you're smart enough to realize that the system is bad. You would question the system. You would challenge it. You would say, this is full of corruption. Its arguments are weak. I'm going to question it, and I'm going to go to the vast zeitgeist of alternatives available in my society. But that zeitgeist is different. Those alternatives are different. And I think everybody who today is a hardcore modern atheist, if they'd been born in 1400, would be hardcore in one of the cool, weird, fringe beliefs that were around in 1400, not somehow a time-traveled version of what modern atheists believe, right?
Yeah,
that you'd still be a radically questioning freethinker. Yeah. But that it is interesting to notice how hard it was and how long it was for even radically questioning freethinkers to arrive at what if there is no plan with a capital P, and that was hard.
Yeah,
we need to credit how hard it was, or we are insulting the people who worked that hard to get there.
And this is something I come across all the time when talking to people about Galileo. Many atheists are convinced that Galileo must have been an atheist, and he must have been just pretending. And I have to point out to them that the whole reason Galileo got into trouble is that the church didn't care about him being a Copernican until he started dabbling in theology. And they cared about that. Yeah. They didn't actually care too much. They actually just sort of said, no, don't do that. We do that. You're just a mathematicus. Stick to your knitting, stick to stay in your lane. Yeah. But anyone who has read his letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, I mean, that is a devout believer trying to reconcile his devout Catholic faith.
Yeah, and people will always say, well, no. The devoutness is just camouflage, right? Because he knows the Inquisition is out there and is going to get him. But the Inquisition is way more likely to go after you if you're dabbling in theology. This is why you'll remember I use this example of, if you were afraid the FBI was going to raid your house, would you carefully, meticulously conceal your smuggled Canadian codeine painkillers that you got when you were in Canada that are technically illegal in the US, but nobody cares, and leave a big bag of crack cocaine on your kitchen table? No, you would not do that. And in a situation in which the Inquisition has 1,000 trials for nitpicky theology things and is really taking people to the extreme for nitpicky theology things and could not care less about atheism, you're not going to conceal atheism under a theological position more likely to get you in trouble for it, right? Scipione Capecchio, who's another figure, or was it Pellier? No, it was Scipione Capecchio, who went to the stake, right? He was one of the Lucriccius scholars, and people pointed him as a closet atheist. And he went to the stake. They burned him. They burned him for defending Luther's principle of sola fide. If you're a closet atheist, you don't go to the stake for sola fide. You say, I don't care, and you go home, and they say, fine, right? So, if you want to die in the Renaissance, defend sola fide, you would never use that to camouflage atheism. Because the Inquisition's attitude toward atheism is, well, atheists are just so wrong that they're definitely damned, and therefore nothing we do can save them, so we're just going to ignore them. Because only a fool, right? They use the quote, the fool said in his heart, there is no God. The official Inquisition position on atheists is only somebody who has something wrong with their brain would ever be persuaded by so obviously false a position as atheism. Therefore, it's priority number 512 on this, because what the Inquisition actually cares about is people they think are 98% right and religious and might get into heaven.
Yeah.
And those people, they're really worried about, right? They're really worried about when it comes about Jansenism, right? Jansenism was just like engineered to distract the Inquisition, right? What is Jansenism? It is Calvinism for Catholics.
Yeah.
Do you want a really grim, depressing God and no free will and all of humanity being wretched, and yet also to have to obey a stupid, corrupt Italian jerk who is the dictatorial monarch of your faith? Do you want both of these things at the same time? Then Jansenism is for you, right? And the Inquisition loathes Jansenism because it appeals to really pious people. Yeah. That's what they're worried about. They're worried about people like Luther, right? Luther, who was himself a monk, who was so pious and hardcore that his abbot had to be like, Luther, chill out and eat, man. You're going to starve yourself to death. We don't want to lose you. Like we lost St. Francis of Assisi, basically starving himself to death because he was so hyper pious. Like, don't piety yourself to death. They're worried about that kind of person being lured away by false faiths, right? Sure. And for the vast majority of people, and especially atheists, they're like, this person is damned anyway, we don't care. Which is why so many Inquisition policies focus on pious people, and almost none of their energy is ever directed against anything that seems like atheism. So when Galileo is putting theology and stuff, right, that's not camo for atheism. What it is he is a brilliant mind who is questioning the world around him and arrives at the systems that are sort of supported by some of the science around him, because he's not turning his back on all of it at once. And that is a perfectly rational thing to not do. He knows he's not an expert in every field. He's an expert in some fields. He's turning his back on the things that the evidence in his fields affects. But the evidence in his fields doesn't tell anything about the soul, right? Whether you can see mountains on the moon or moons around Jupiter is not data on whether there's an afterlife or not, right? So he's excited by the data he has, and he's therefore moving in directions that question what he understands, but that doesn't automatically therefore reject everything else, because that's harder to get to.
I'm in the process of finishing an article on another one on Galileo, on the 1992 speech by John Paul II about Galileo. There's a myth that John Paul II was the first time the Catholic Church admitted they were wrong, and that he pardoned Galileo and apologized, none of which actually happens in the speech. And it wasn't the first time they admitted they were wrong. But it's interesting that what John Paul II does say is the theologians got the theology wrong and Galileo got the theology right. And Galileo was actually a little bit wrong in the science, and the theologians were sticking to the science of the day, which kind of turns things on its head. I also like your point on a similar tack, where you pointed out that one of the best scientific laboratories and centres of study in the world in the early 16th century was the Collegium Romanum, which was basically the university of the Jesuits and the Inquisition, which is slightly paradoxical.
They felt they had the duty to peer review the things that were being published, and so they needed to have a big experimental laboratory to test people's results and see if they were right. Exactly. So the Galileo style experimentation that continued with people who literally were inquisitors professionally doing the experiments. This is the wonderful work of a researcher called Daniele Macuglia, Macuglia, if anyone wants to look up his stuff on the aftermath of Galileo. It's such good stuff. But good. Let me jump back and do my, Petra, how we get from A to B, if that is, because I think we can riff on the aftermath of that some too, right? So let me give you a narrative, and then we can talk about how atheism and many other things fit in it, right? If we go back to aftermath of Black Death moment, right? So end of the 1300s. Petrarch is one of a community of people. He's the person who A, becomes famous, and B, survives the Black Death. All of the others die. So he's the one who becomes famous and whose name gets pointed to. If they hadn't all died, I think we would have more names of his friends that we credit this moment to. But he looks around him and he sees Italy specifically being in a terrible and dangerous situation, that Transalpine powers have become large and centralized and have large armies, whereas in Italy we have these tiny city-states that have very small populations, can only raise very small armies, and they all hate each other. And they all loathe their next door neighbors. Florence hates Pisa, Pisa hates Florence, Florence hates Luca, Luca hates Pisa. None of them will help each other in crisis. And he watches as civil war and faction fighting and invasion get worse and worse, and Italy seems to be about to die of self-inflicted wounds. And we have to remember that Shakespeare's depiction of the Montagues and Capulets in Romeo and Juliet is barely fiction, right? This is the world in which major families are starting bloody street fights in the street. And when Romeo is guilty of homicide, their expectation is, of course, he will get away with it and will be immediately pardoned by the prince. It will be unthinkable for Romeo to actually suffer real consequences for committing murder. That is Petrarch's world. He looks around and says, this is a chaos, and it is diminishing and worsening. The wars are getting worse. The deaths are getting worse. The invaders are getting stronger. Italy is going to dwindle to nothing and be swallowed up by foreign powers and our own greed unless we do something. What do we do? Say, Petrarch and the circle around him. And they look back to ancient Rome and they say, in antiquity, Italy ruled all. Rome ruled all. We were Romans. What did we do then? How can we do that? Let's figure out the arts of the ancients and try to revive them as an Italian salvation project, as a moonshot, to try to find a way for this fractious and fractured Italy to gain strength. We're used to associating the classical revival and the Renaissance with technologies, with linear perspective, aqueducts, engineering, domes. But Petrarch and his peers focus more on the intellectual technology, that statecraft. They want the library that raised Marcus Aurelius, and the library that raised Julius Caesar, and the library that raised Cicero, and that raised Hadrian, that raised the 4 good emperors from that long patch, right? The Pax Romana. The only time in the history of all of Italy, in recorded history, there was extended peace in Italy, is under the good gay emperors, as a modern label might call it, but them and Augustus. The dream of the Pax Romana, which remember is peace. Peace meaning a woman carrying a bag of gold can walk in safety from the northern coast of France to Turkey, not fearing bandits on the roads or pirates on the seas, because there is peace and there are none, right? This is the only period in history that has been like that. There are pirates in the Mediterranean now, because we have never matched the degree of peace and enforcement and stability that Europe knew in the Pax Romana. And when Petrarch reads about this, Petrarch, who saw not only almost all of his friends die in the Black Death, but 2 survived. He got a letter. He was so happy. 2 friends who survived, and after the Black Death made arrangements to come visit him, and on the way to come visit him were attacked by bandits, and one of them was murdered, and the other one was stabbed and nearly died, and he didn't see him for 2 years, so he barely. So anyway, bandits are real. Pirates are real. These threats are real. And reading about the idea that you could walk in safety from one end of the known world to the other makes Rome loom in these people's minds as a kind of salvation. So what do they want? They want the libraries that raised Hadrian, so that they can educate the next generation of Italian rulers, right? The princes and princesses and dukes and heads of merchant families. They want to give them the education that formed Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius, so that when they grow up, they will rule wisely. They will not, like Romeo and his family, knife each other in the street and demand to be let off for murder because they're special. They will, like the Roman Brutus, who executed his own sons when they plotted against the state, put virtue and the good of the people first and their own good second. That's what they want. And Poggio grew up in the classroom of one of Petrarch's surviving friends and learned Latin from him. Learned Latin with the goal of, we want to reconstruct these libraries so that we will have virtuous rulers who will rule wisely and well and put the good of the people before the honor of their family. And when Poggio is trekking through the Alps, he's looking for that. He's looking for the books Petrarch says will make a generation of Hadrians. And he's excited by Lucriccius because Lucriccius is like Virgil, and Virgil is the education of Roman emperors and great men, right? That's the excitement. That's why he's there. We're very glad he's there. We who love atheism and love the atheism that's in the text are very glad that he's there. But his motive is a very specific one. He wants the political knowledge. And I know this because I have looked at personally every single surviving manuscript of Lucriccius from this period, including the one the Poggio copied over. And I have also looked at 300 other copies of Lucriccius from the early print period. And you can see what people underline and what they mark in the margin. And it's the ethics and the politics.
Yeah.
They are there for the things that teach you how to be an ethicist and a politician and a ruler and Roman virtue and how to act like Cicero. That is where they annotate it really heavily. And the sections about atoms and the swerve, almost none. I'll come back to the swerve in a moment because it's the most fun bit, where there's only 3 comments on the swerve in the whole written tradition of these 350 books that I looked at, and they're all juicy and great. But if we move forward, so Petrarch says, we can do this. Let's moonshot. Come on, guys. Let's be Rome again, because it's that or death. Poggio tramps through the Alps because it's that or death. And was trying to assemble the library that will raise philosopher kings. And this is funded by people like rich Cosimo de' Medici and people like the wealthy and powerful families of Genoa and the rulers and dukes of Milan, because they also don't want to be conquered by France or slaughtered by Germany or see their cities burned down because Romeo and Tybalt are constantly dueling and wiping out the ruling class. Yeah. They also want stability. They are the ones who invest the millions of dollars that it takes to produce a library when a single book costs as much as a house. So when I say that Cosimo de' Medici, the very wealthy banker who knows that Florence has a bullseye on its face because Florence is full of all the banking fortunes of all the biggest banking families and literal piles of gold in the basement. And also everyone loathes Florence because it's a merchant republic that wiped out its nobility. So there's nobody there worth talking to. And also it has a reputation internationally as a center of sin and depravity, and especially homosexuality. And the verb for anal sex in 6 European languages is fiorentinare, a version of to Florentine. And you could be persecuted for sodomy on the grounds of ever having visited Florence in the law codes of other countries like France, right? Yeah. So if you're a king and you want to conquer something and come home with gold and tribute, do you want to attack the incredibly rich, friendless pit of scum and villainy that nobody likes and has all the gold? Or do you want to attack anything else, right? There's a wrong answer to this question. You want Florence, and you want the similar Italian city republics where no friend is going to come save them because they all loathe each other. And so if you're Cosimo and it is your gold in the basement of your city and you're scared, you pay the millions of dollars, right? So when Cosimo spots the fact that his doctor has a young son who is smart and good at languages, he buys a house and sets the kid up in a house and gets a Greek tutor and sets the kid up with a Greek tutor and buys the complete works of Plato in Greek, which is as expensive as buying every store on a street. Yeah. And has the kid raised on ancient Greek and on Plato so that when the kid grows up, that kid can tutor Cosimo's grandchildren, because that is how far in advance you have to plan to have an educational revolution. And that's where we get Marsilio Ficino, son of Cosimo's family doctor, the Platonist who translates Plato and raises Lorenzo de' Medici, right? And Lorenzo de' Medici is the generation that are supposed to be these philosopher princes shaped by this. And the next generation, the generation of Lorenzo's kids, the generation of Machiavelli, who grows up on this education, visiting the same libraries and reading the same copies of the same books that educated Lorenzo. This generation that comes about, notice time has passed, right? Petrarch lives through the Black Death. It's 1348, it's 1380 when Petrarch passes this torch to Poggio's generation. It's 1417. Sorry, did I say 15 when I meant 13? 1380, yeah. 1417 when Poggio is in the Alps and finds Lucriccius. It's the 1430s when Cosimo starts seizing power. It's the 1440s and 1450s when Cosimo has young Marsilio Ficino learning Greek and cite translating Plato to him on his deathbed. That's what Cosimo asked for. I don't want a priest reading to me out of the Bible. I want the Plato that has not been available in any language I could read in my lifetime, but I've finally raised a Platonist. I want him sight translating it to me at my bedside so I can have every morsel of this alternative to Christianity available to me, right? He's not an atheist. He's a free thinker who is interested in what is available, right? All of this stuff comes back. And I'm going to pause because I could tell you wanted to comment, but we're now halfway through the story, right?
Okay, go. Well, please continue. This is good. It's great. It's a summary of your whole book. This is great.
So, all right, we're halfway through the story. We've gone as far as we have Lorenzo de' Medici, philosopher prince, also cunning and conniving politician, hero and villain of many stories, raised on this education that is supposed to make people act like Hadrian. And Machiavelli is growing up on this. Leonardo da Vinci is growing up on this. Lots of people are growing up on this. But let's rewind. Petrarch was very pious.
Yep.
It's all through his works. He has the Secretum, which is this wonderful philosophical dialogue based on Boethius, where he's talking to St. Augustine. You can see it in the personal letters that he wrote during the Black Death. They're so moving, right? The first letters are, this friend is dead, but I know he's with the Lord and this is heaven's plan and I should trust it and be grateful. And then you get to the next letter and he's like, 3 more of my friends have died. I'm scared, but I know that the plan of providence is complex and that bad things have happened before within it, but good things have come from them. I will trust. And by the time it's the 10th and the 12th friend, you can see him lose it. Yeah. I've reread those letters recently. You can see, he says, I can't see it anymore. I don't understand what we did that was so much worse than every other generation that we deserved this. It is so moving to see his faith pushed to the edge, but he comes out the other end of it still pious, with the attitude, much like Voltaire, that he doesn't understand the plan, but that he still sees an author behind what has happened, and he will strive to understand it. Petrarch is so moving on this stuff. Even decades later, in his De Remedies, the remedies against fortune, fair and foul. This is the text where he gives advice on how to not let your equilibrium, not let your thoughts, not let yourself be made into a bad person by the assails of fortune. How to conquer fear, how to conquer greed, how to conquer ambition, how to conquer grief. So he has, is your friend dead? They can now, that means they're safe. They can't suffer anymore. Remind yourself of that. Are you scared that your country will be conquered in war? Troy was conquered in war, and it was a great country that left its stamp on the rest of time. Would you be ashamed to have called yourself Trojan? Then you should not be terrified in this moment when your country may fall. You would still love and be proud of your country. And he also has remedies against good fortune, right? Are you proud of the fact that you're handsome? Well, that won't last. Are you proud of the fact that you can run really well? Well, your knees are going to give out. You're faster than people who don't. My favorite ones are his consolations for scholars not to be proud of themselves. Are you proud your book has been published? Well, people are going to criticize you far away where you're not there to defend yourself, says Petrarch, who is so right, of course, about this and many other things. And when he comes to the Black Death, he can't do it. You can tell that he can't do it. He still can't do it. It's too much. It goes beyond the apparatus for which his faith prepared him. And he says, are you scared of war? Here's why you shouldn't be scared of war. Are you scared of death? Here's why you shouldn't be scared of death. Are you scared of the plague? You should be. Is that scary? And you should feel that fear, especially because he says that fear is pity for the sufferings of humankind. And if you want more consolation than that, says Petrarch, I offer this. Why should you be more afraid to die alone than to die like this, having much company? That's all he has, right? Because he's hit the limits of what his belief system offers him. as apparatus. But Petrarch is deeply pious. And so when he says, let's find the classics, let's find the works of the ancients, the library that shaped Hadrian, he's sure that everything they find will agree with and support Christianity. And that there will be some, pagan nonsense that's wrong, but that the fundamental truths, right, the things that Plato is correct about and Aristotle is correct about, the deep stuff, all of it will support, he thinks, Christianity. He thinks this, not having read the stuff, right? It's important for us to remember that Petrarch, who says, hey, everyone read Plato, doesn't have Plato. Hey, everyone read Homer. I can't read Homer.
Apart from the tomatoes.
But if you do it, I'm sure it will be just like the Aeneid, which Europe had spent 1,000 years coming up with a really sophisticated apparatus to make the Aeneid seem Christian, right?
Yeah.
And he's sure that when they find this stuff, it's going to agree. And he tells his students, they think it's going to agree. And when Poggio is crossing the Alps and opens the pages and finds Lucriccius, he's sure this is going to agree. He thinks that what he's going to find is going to be just like Virgil, and it's not going to be any more challenge to Christianity than Zeus and Apollo are. And that all of the core stuff in it is going to show that all of their science is right. It's just going to clarify it. That's what they think is going to be in the books when they don't have the books yet, right? Fast forward to 1450, where they have the books, and they're reading the books, and they're like, these books kind of don't agree with Christianity or with each other. These books really don't agree with each other, right? Because they're used to a world in which the Franciscans and the Dominicans disagreeing about whether it's better to love God or know God is like the biggest intellectual rift in their scholarly world. They're used to thinking of ancients as if they had been sort of variant sects of one thing. They thought that the difference between an Aristotelian and a Stoic would be no bigger than the difference between a Franciscan and a Dominican, which is a big rift within a narrow band. But they expected to find the ancients mostly agreeing with each other. And then instead they have Lucriccius, who is super disagreeing with Plato, who is super disagreeing with Aristotle, who is super disagreeing. They're all super disagreeing with each other. But it takes a long time to actually have enough books to realize that, right? They didn't even have Marcus Aurelius until into the 1500s, well into the 1500s. Yeah. Right? They didn't know what the ancients were going to say. They didn't realize how many different, disagreeing, competing ideas were going to join the thing. They thought, here is the path of knowledge, we're going to broaden it this much. And they broaden it this much. Yeah. Right? Because they had no idea how different the arguments were going to be, how fundamentally different the different schools were going to be. They found a vastly richer, more amazing ecosystem than they had ever imagined. Right? They found more than they were looking for. They were looking for something narrow, and they found something giant. Not just Lucriccius, but lots of other things. So then, two things happening at the same time when we get to the generation that are adults in the year 1490, right? Leonardo, Michelangelo is a kid at that point, but he gets grandfathered in. Machiavelli, the people who are coming of age in time to be in the wars in 1500. They have two things. One is the ancients were much more plural, much more complicated, much more stimulating, much more brain-opening, brain-widening, and weird than they had imagined, and challenged a lot more than they ever thought they would challenge. That's part one. Part two is the actual wars they fight, because here we are, 3 generations into the project of raising everyone on the libraries that made the Romans, and Petrarch dreamed it, and Poggio assembled the library, and Cosimo paid for it, and Ficino grew up in it so that he could tutor the next generation. And here we are with the great-grandchildren of Cosimo, and they have grown up with Greek, and they have grown up with Latin, they have grown up with Plato, which is in print, and everybody who is getting a serious education can all have it. We've all got it. This is the generation that will be raised on the books that produced Marcus Aurelius and Hadrian. And what do we get? We get Cesare Borgia brutally murdering all of the leaders of all of the towns Right? And we get to this period where I was just reviewing the leading causes of death of rulers of city-states in the decades between 1490 and 1510. And the leading cause of death is Cesare Borgia having you murdered, followed by your Malatesta wife murdering you, followed by the Black Death making a sad third, with honorable mention to the malarial marshes at the mouth of the Po River. These are the leading, like, they're worse people, right? They come out of the Cesare Borgia grew up on Plato and Greek and Latin. Here is his sister Lucrezia Borgia writing gorgeous humanistic poetry. These are the people who had this education, and Machiavelli watches them explode Italy into the worst and most terrible wars, right? Everybody who invades Italy, they also had this education. By this point, the King of France has it, the King of Spain has it, Queen Isabella has it, Emperor Maximilian has it. These all people grew up on Plato, and they're all slicing Italy to ribbons. And Machiavelli lives through this, and there's this amazing letter, you know, the letter I open with, the book, where Ercole Bentivoglio, who was a mercenary captain, had read Machiavelli's unfinished history of the decade they just lived through, the decade that has 1500 in it. And he writes to Machiavelli, you must write a good history. You must continue and finish and write a good history of this period, or future generations will never believe how terrible it was.
Yeah.
And they will never forgive us, right? They will never forgive us for having lost so much so quickly.
Yeah.
So there is a crisis here because clearly we, you know, did the Petrarch thing. We got the books, we built the libraries, we educated the princes, and treason, treachery, strangulation, and murder are being more effective and bringing people to power as the people who do all the stuff that the virtuous books say to do die.
Yeah.
So what do we conclude from this? And this is Machiavelli's moment, right? And Machiavelli looks at it and says, what I conclude from it is we don't understand the first thing about how stuff works. So let's start over and let's study more carefully, and let's use the classics, not because we're going to reconstruct Marcus Aurelius by or Hadrian by osmotically trying to absorb the same intellectual nutrients that were in the books that shaped them, because somehow just reading them will make you act like them through some kind of impression in wax.
Yeah.
Let's instead use all the great stuff we've discovered as examples of what worked and what didn't, and what was true and what wasn't true, and who won which battle. And let's imitate the battles where the commander won, regardless of whether the commander was an ethical person. Let's look at what he actually did in the battle. And if he was a bad person, but he won that battle, let's study that battle anyway. And maybe you don't want to imitate the actual unethical things that he did, but you certainly want to imitate what he did that made him win that battle. Let's start over, because we clearly don't understand how stuff works. And this is where I'm going to rewind to, I hinted that there are 3 copies of Lucriccius from this period in which there is a note in the margin about the swerve. There are only 3. One of them is copied from another, so it's really sort of 2. And the one note says, this is an unchristian opinion, opinio non Christiana.
Bad.
Right, there are 3. There's opinio non Christiana. There's another one which says absurditas in sententia, absurd to even consider. The idea that there is a fundamental chaotic movement to matter, and that might be the source of free will. Absurditas in sententia. I love that one. The third comment is from the weirdest of all the Lucretius manuscripts, all 52. It's the only one that has like no annotation in the sections where all the others are annotated. It has nothing on the statecraft bits. It has nothing on the sex scene. Everyone annotates the sex scene. People love the sex scene. Nothing on the cool, cute nicknames to call your girlfriend. Nothing on the lines that were imitated by Virgil. It only has notes on the atomism. The technical details of how the atoms move, how they group, how they form substances, the sections in books 2 and 3 that are nearly blank in every other copy. And next to the swerve, it has the summary heading that there is a curve in nature, and from this we have free will, right? Yeah. Which is what we would put in our summary. And that's Machiavelli's copy.
Yeah. Brilliant.
That's Machiavelli. This was the big fighting of my dissertation. And I was like, proving that Machiavelli was really smart and ahead of his time is probably the least surprising thing I could possibly prove in my dissertation.
But it's still very cool, eh?
And it tells us that that generation, right, because he's the only one who's marking this in the manuscript period, which is up through the 1510s. He's alone then. But there's a dozen of them by 1550.
Uh-huh.
And there's 50 of them by 1580.
So there's a change.
Right?
Yeah.
The trend begins. Because what is the 1500s? Is the moment at which everyone says, wow, we don't know how anything works. And we were wrong about the circulation of the blood. We were wrong about what would be in Plato. And we have all these broad ideas and they disagree with each other. And Aristotle disagrees with Plato and Plato disagrees with Seneca and Seneca disagrees with Epictetus. And all of these things are broadening our world. And it's in the middle of that the Reformation begins. And the big contribution of the Reformation is not overthrowing religion, because boy, did they replace religion with different religion. More. And a Calvinist authoritarian regime is just as authoritarian as a Catholic authoritarian regime. But what it is a million more people who disagree with each other, right? We've multiplied the breadth of opinions from just the stuff that was available in this one moment in late Middle Ages to also all the ancient stuff to also this bajillion new ideas that all of the Reformation people are having, which multiplies again the breadth of options and opinions and authorities that are around saying, what if it's this? What if it's this? What if it's this? What if it's this? Which is what gets the rapacious, excited minds to say, there are way too many claims of what might be true. We need to come up with a good method to sort what's true, right? And if you get your first moment when 50 people are interested in the swerve and wondering whether it might be true and marking it in the margin, some enthusiastically, some negatively, all questioningly, it's not a coincidence that 10 years later the scientific method is codified.
Bacon.
Right? This is when we get Bacon and Descartes, not out of nowhere, just as Poggio wasn't climbing the Alps out of nowhere, but as the result of a momentum in which, and here is what you just heard really fast, Petrarch says, we're all going to die. The moon shot his libraries. Poggio helps build the library. Cosimo funds the library. Machiavelli reads all the books of the library, but the hoped-for project of this will make peaceful leaders who will bring about world peace instead results in Cesare Borgia and disproving the fact that the four humors theory was a thing and now the heart is a pump. So now what do? We panic in the midst of the breadth of options, and therefore drowning in options, we must come up with methods to figure them out. And of course, it's in the midst of that as options multiply and everybody is open-minded about all of them, atheism gains momentum and begins to be a movement, right? Yeah. There are atheists in Machiavelli's day. There's two. I worked really hard and I go through it. I talked to colleagues and I found them, right? And they're definitely atheists. Guido Dona up there in Venice in his trial saying there is no God. I love this man. He is an illiterate fishmonger. And he says in his Inquisition record, there is no God. Like he is real. He is there, but he's quite alone, right? There are very few people arriving at that because they're arriving at the cool Platonic stuff and the cool Aristotelian stuff and all the other stuff that's new and questioning and exciting and needs to be combed through and explored because it's new before you can arrive at other stuff. It's natural that it is a teamwork of generations when something begins to be rivaled by many other options, for those options to be explored, bounced against each other, exploded against each other, multiplied further until people say, wait a minute, we need a new method for sorting this. Science begins and things grow out of that, right? And everybody in that period who worked on climbing the Alps to find the books, who worked on copying the books, who works on reading the books for the first time when it's so hard, when even the language is so hard. There aren't dictionaries for, rustic Latin or ancient Greek when they're beginning. All of the people who work hard to build the libraries and read it and try it, they all get credit in the putting in front of eager minds the stuff necessary for atheism. so that atheism can be a movement and not a couple of rare people with the same degree of chutzpah of a creationist who say, I'm going to be turning my back on everything to do this. Yeah. Turning your back on everything to do something is very brave, but being in an intellectual world in which atheism becomes one of the many alternatives that you're debating and putting side by side and excitedly exploring and looking at the evidence for, that is the collective achievement of generations of people working hard on trying to make the world better. Sure. And they make the world, as so often happens when we try to make it better, they make the world weirder and more plural and broader, and not necessarily better, certainly not in terms of life expectancy, but I think in terms of freedom of thought. And that is a great achievement. It isn't what they meant to achieve. But
that was, I think, a great summary of, I think it's 670 pages, your book, or thereabouts.
745 counting the index.
It was, exactly. And the thing I love about the way in which you sort of explain is you bring everything in, you bring everything together, but without reducing it to simple fairy tales of good and bad, of good periods and bad periods and so on. I'm aware of time, and I'm very you're very generous, so thank you, Ada. We will need to sort of wrap it up there. All I'd say is highly recommend. I'll get it in front of the camera. Inventing the Renaissance, Myths of the Golden Age.
And for those who have read The Swerve, whether you like it or you hate it, I really encourage you to look at the full-length answer of 15 years of thinking hard about this as the person whose topic in the world is closest to his, right? Because I am one of a couple dozen Lucriccius in the Renaissance specialists. I'm the only one who came to it looking for atheism.
Yeah.
The others came to it looking for poetry or looking for history of medicine or looking for, I came to it for this. And the Greenblatt question was my problem.
Yeah. And that section
deserved a long answer. Right?
That section in your book, I think, is I'd call it an antidote to Greenblatt, but I agree. Whether you like it or hate it, Greenblatt, I think your book is highly recommended. I'd also say all the stuff that Ada just summarised is exemplified in a lot more detail, very amusing detail. I haven't laughed out loud at a work of history for a very long time. If you want to hear about popes who had parrots that speak Latin, and a man with 3 testicles, and the fellow who killed his wife, his servant, his maidservant, and then set himself on fire.
And how he was justly punished by God. That's the end of the book title there.
Very important. Ada, thank you very much for talking to us today. It's been wonderful. You and I could probably talk all day, but I know.
Yes, I think we could. This was a treat, but also, to the audience, thank you for caring seriously enough about the history of atheism to watch this.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a really rich, amazing, beautiful history. And I think it's easy for us to want to believe the narratives that make it feel easier, that make it feel like there was always this atheist underground and it worked hard and it resulted in our present. And it's courageous and difficult to look at the messy pluralness and just how hard it was and just how miraculous it is that so many different things came together, many of them by people who did not intend to help liberate atheism, but whose works to liberate humanity in other ways had that side effect.
Yeah,
the teamwork it took to get to the stage that atheism could be the beautiful blossoming that it is in Diderot and beyond is exquisite. And as hard as it is to turn away from, nobody likes feeling like we were lied to. Nobody likes feeling like the history of atheism that we knew was false. But the real one is so much braver and so much more beautiful and so much more difficult and shows how much it took and how miraculous it is that we managed to get to the point that this could be freed and that the human mind could have this power and this breadth and spectrum of exploration. So I urge you to think of this kind of history not as an assault on the history and tradition that you find comforting, but as opening it to the fact that the real history was more plural, harder, longer,
And much more
required
interesting.
not just a couple of geniuses who were in the right place at the right time, but the teamwork of thousands of people like us who all had to have the difficult conversations and admit their insecurities to each other and say, wait a minute, I don't know if this book means what I used to think it means. The pluralization of that history and including how many people it took to get to that teamwork, I find inspirational.
Yeah. And I think that's a wonderful note on which to end. I think pretty much every single one of my articles on my website and most of the conversations I have on the video channel, no, it wasn't like that. It was much more complicated and much more interesting. So thank you for a beautifully complicated but extremely interesting analysis. And all I can say to everyone is race out and buy Ada's book. It's great.
And thank you for creating this to bring together a community of people who care about the history of atheism, because it is such an amazing, amazing history, and it deserves all that attention. So I'm glad you're bringing people together to talk about it.
Thanks, Ada. All the best. Goodbye. Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Ada Palmer, and I highly recommend her book, Inventing the Renaissance, Myths of a Golden Age. It's my favourite book of the year so far. But until next time, see you again here soon.